Just 5 years ago, I stood on a stage and watched a paralyzed woman take her first steps using my invention. My net worth was over $1 billion. Today, I have exactly $87 to my name. It wasn't a bad investment that ruined me. It was a ghost. A phantom in the legal system who never built a thing but owned a single piece of paper that gave him the right to destroy everything I had ever created. They say the patent system was designed to protect the little guy, the lone inventor. It's a beautiful lie. I'm here to tell you how that system, that very shield, was turned into the perfect weapon to destroy me. My name is Silas Blackwood, and this isn't a story about a business that failed. It's a story about an idea that succeeded too well. I never wanted to be a businessman. My home wasn't a boardroom. It was the sterile, quiet hum of a university laboratory. My passion wasn't profit margins. It was the human brain, that 3-pound universe of electricity and mystery between our ears. My entire life had been dedicated to one singular purpose: to decipher its secrets, specifically to help those trapped within their own bodies by stroke, by injury, by the cruel lottery of birth. My work was about giving a voice back to the silent and movement back to the still. For 15 years I was a ghost myself, haunting the neuroscience department of a respectable but certainly not glamorous university. My life was a cycle of grant proposals, late-night experiments, and the quiet, incremental joy of data that suggested you were on the right path. My team was small, just 3 of us: a brilliant postdoctoral fellow named Lena, a PhD candidate named Ben, and me. We weren't chasing fame. We were chasing a whisper of a possibility, the possibility of creating a non-invasive neural interface. Most of the work in the field involved invasive surgery, drilling into the skull to implant electrodes. It was brutal, risky, and reserved for the most extreme cases. I believed there was a better way. I envisioned a device that could read the brain's intricate signals from the outside, a headset that could listen to the symphony of a person's intentions and translate them into action. We called it the Synapse Bridge. The name felt right. It wasn't replacing a broken part. It was building a bridge over a chasm, reconnecting the mind to the world. For years, the progress was agonizingly slow. We'd solve one problem, only to discover 10 more. There were moments of despair so profound, I'd find myself staring at the wall of the lab at 3 a.m., convinced I was wasting my life on a science fiction fantasy. But then, a flicker of success, a clean signal, a computer cursor moved by thought alone, then a robotic arm that could pick up a block. Each tiny victory was fuel. The day we successfully had a test subject, a man paralyzed from the neck down, type his wife's name on a screen using only his mind. Well, that's a moment that redefines your soul. We weren't just publishing papers anymore. We were holding a miracle in our hands. That miracle got us noticed. A small article in a scientific journal was picked up by a tech blog, and suddenly, my quiet world was shattered. The first calls were from other universities, then medical device companies. But the one that changed everything came from a man named Mark Theron. He wasn't a scientist or a doctor. He was a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley, a predator of a different kind cloaked in the language of a messiah. He flew out to meet us in our cramped, cluttered lab. He didn't wear a suit. He wore expensive jeans and a casual blazer, a uniform designed to say, "I'm one of you," but with a much bigger checkbook. He listened intently as I explained the science, his eyes lighting up not at the technical details, but at the human stories I told. He understood the power of a narrative. He didn't talk about initial public offerings or exit strategies. He spoke a language I understood, a language designed to seduce an idealist like me. "Silas," he said, his voice resonating with manufactured passion, "what you have here can't stay in a lab. You're helping one person at a time. We can help 1,000,000. We're not just building a company. We're building a legacy. We're scaling hope." He painted a picture of a world where our synapse bridge was as common as a hearing aid, a world where spinal cord injuries no longer meant a lifetime of paralysis. He made me feel that keeping my invention in the slow, underfunded world of academia was a selfish act. He made me feel like it was my moral obligation to say yes. And so, against my better judgment, I did. I left the only world I'd ever known, We founded Neuralink. Mark handled the business, the lawyers, the fundraising. My only condition was that I remain in charge of the science, the heart of the operation. He readily agreed. The transition was like being thrown into the deep end of a pool filled with sharks. Suddenly, my life was a whirlwind of term sheets, stock options, and board meetings. I felt like an imposter. While men in suits argued about burn rates and total addressable markets, I just wanted to get back to the lab and refine the signal processing algorithms. This new world operated on a logic I couldn't grasp. It felt hollow, obsessed with perception over substance. I delegated everything I didn't understand, which was almost everything outside of the R&D department. I put my blind trust in Mark and his team of experts. They were the translators, the guides in this foreign land of commerce. My job was to deliver the miracle. Their job was to handle the paperwork that came with it. That division of labor would become my undoing. I was living the dream of every scientist, virtually unlimited resources to pursue my life's work and change the world. And I know so many of you have that same kind of passion, that one thing you would dedicate your life to. Before I tell you how that dream became a nightmare, do me a favor and let me know in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It's good to know who you're talking to. And if you believe in the power of a single idea to change the world, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, because you need to hear the rest of this journey. With the funding Mark secured, we made leaps in a year that would have taken a decade at the university. We refined the hardware, miniaturized the components, and created software so intuitive it felt like magic. We were on the cusp of FDA approval, and the world was watching. I was hailed as a genius, a visionary. I told myself that the nauseating world of business was a necessary evil, a toll I had to pay to bring my creation to life. I thought the purity of the invention, the undeniable good it did, made it invincible. I believed that as long as the science was sound, nothing else mattered. I was a fool. The launch of the Synapse Bridge wasn't a product release, it was a global phenomenon. We didn't just sell a device, we delivered resurrections. I will carry the memories of those first few years to my grave, moments of pure, unadulterated triumph that felt almost sacred. I remember a 7-year-old girl named Chloe, born with cerebral palsy, using the bridge to paint a picture of a yellow sun for the first time. Her parents wept, the engineers wept, I wept. I remember an elderly concert pianist, his hands rendered useless by a stroke, who sat at a grand piano and, through a custom-made bionic interface, played a flawless Chopin nocturne, his mind conducting the melody his body no longer could. These were not data points on a chart, they were shattered lives made whole again. The media called it the Neuralink miracle. We were on the covers of magazines, from Scientific American to Time. I was awarded prizes I had only ever read about, invited to speak at forums where I shared the stage with world leaders. It was surreal, a disembodying experience. They called me a hero, a visionary. In my own mind, I was still just the man from the lab, bewildered by the noise. Mark, of course, reveled in it. He orchestrated the narrative perfectly. Neuralink wasn't just a company, it was a movement. Our headquarters, a gleaming tower of glass and steel in the heart of Silicon Valley, became a symbol of this new, benevolent technology. The press nicknamed it the Olympus of Glass. From the outside, it was a monument to transparency and progress. From the inside, I often felt like a specimen in a jar. My wealth grew to a scale I couldn't comprehend. The numbers on my portfolio statements were meaningless abstractions, astronomical figures that had no connection to my reality. I didn't buy yachts or private islands. My one great indulgence was building a personal research facility in my home, a lab that rivaled the one at the university, where I could continue my real work in peace, away from the endless demands of being a CEO. My life was a strange paradox. Publicly, I was the face of a corporate giant. Privately, I was a recluse, hiding among my own schematics and prototypes, trying to hold on to the scientist I once was. The beginning of the end arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet click of an email attachment. It came from our chief legal counsel, a memo with a subject line so mundane it was almost insulting. Notice of infringement claim. Attached was a document, a formal notification from an entity I had never heard of. Cognitive Pathway Ventures. The document alleged that the core data transmission protocol of the synapse bridge, the very soul of the machine, infringed upon a patent they had recently acquired. The patent number was US 8,145,316B2. I remember the number because I would later see it in my nightmares. It was titled with breathtaking vagueness, "A System for Routing Bioelectrical Signals to an External Processor." I pulled up the patent document itself. It wasn't a blueprint for a device. It was a collection of abstract flowcharts and dense, legalistic prose. It described a concept, not an invention. It was a ghost, a theoretical sketch of an idea, filed over a decade ago by two engineers who had never built a prototype, never published a paper, and whose company had gone bankrupt years prior. Cognitive Pathway Ventures hadn't invented it. They had bought it from the bankruptcy auction for pennies, a vulture picking over a corporate carcass for any asset it could weaponize. I read it with the analytical mind of a scientist, and what I felt wasn't fear, but a profound, almost academic contempt. This document had the same relationship to the synapse bridge that a child's drawing of a rocket has to a Saturn V. It was a primitive abstraction, a fantasy. To suggest our complex, nuanced, life-altering technology was built upon this flimsy foundation was, to my mind, an insult to the laws of physics. I walked into the emergency meeting in the Olympus of glass with a sense of detached amusement. Our legal team was there, as was Mark, his usual relaxed demeanor replaced by a tightly coiled tension. "It's a patent troll, Silas," our lead lawyer, a man named Harris, said flatly. "They don't make anything, they don't contribute anything. They buy up broad, ambiguous patents and use the threat of costly litigation to extort settlements from real companies." He explained the business model with the weary resignation of a doctor diagnosing a chronic disease. He advised we make it go away. They know we have deep pockets. They'll be expecting a fight, but what they really want is a quick payday. We can probably make this disappear for a few million. It's a cost of doing business, a tax on innovation. A tax on innovation. The phrase ignited something cold and hard in my chest. We were healing the sick, restoring lives. They were parasites, attempting to bleed the host. Paying them felt like a moral contamination. It felt like admitting their parasitic claim had legitimacy. Before I could voice my indignation, Mark spoke up, and his perspective surprised me. He wasn't looking at a spreadsheet, he was looking at a stage. "No," he said, his voice hard. "We don't pay. We fight. We turn this into a story. Neuralink, the company that cures paralysis, stands up to the patent trolls that plague Silicon Valley. We make this a public crusade. We'll get every tech journalist, every patient advocacy group on our side. We won't just win in court, we'll win in the court of public opinion. We will drag these bottom feeders into the light and obliterate them. It'll be the best marketing we've ever had." It was a masterful performance. He wasn't appealing to my business sense. He was appealing to my idealism, to my belief in justice. He was framing the fight not as a financial calculation, but as a moral imperative. Harris, the lawyer, looked uneasy. "Mark, with all due respect, a jury doesn't care about a good story. They care about what a patent claim says, and these things are intentionally confusing. A prolonged fight will cost tens of millions in legal fees, drain resources, and distract the entire company for years, with no guarantee of a win." But I wasn't listening to Harris's pragmatism. I was captivated by Mark's vision of a righteous battle. He was offering me a chance not just to defend my creation, but to champion the cause of all creators. He was offering me a war I believed in. My decision was instantaneous. It felt like the only choice a person of principle could make. I would not allow my life's work to be tainted by paying tribute to a phantom. We would not negotiate with parasites. We would set a precedent. We would fight. Harris sighed, a quiet admission of defeat, and began discussing the budget for the legal defense. I barely heard him. In my mind, I was already picturing our victory, the headlines that would praise our courage, the message it would send to every innovator in the world. I saw myself as a guardian of scientific truth, standing against the forces of greed and cynicism. I had spent my life in a world of logic and reason, a world where the best evidence and the most elegant solution always won. I foolishly believed the rest of the world operated on the same principles. That evening, a formal settlement offer arrived. They had done their research. They knew the value of our company, the depth of our cash reserves. They weren't asking for a nuisance fee. They were asking for $50 million to walk away and never bother us again. It was an astronomical sum, but to a multi-billion-dollar company, it was a survivable wound. A painful one, but survivable. Mark slid the document across the polished mahogany table of the conference room. "Look at the arrogance," he scoffed. I just laughed. It was such a preposterous number, such a flagrant act of extortion, that it only solidified my resolve. "Not 1 cent, I told him, sliding the document back. "The truth will prevail." I truly believed it. I believed in the system. I believed that justice was a mechanism designed to protect genuine innovation from fraudulent claims. That blind, arrogant faith was the most expensive mistake of my life. I went into that legal battle expecting a duel of wits, a sophisticated debate over the merits of our technology versus their abstract claim. I envisioned a clean, intellectual contest fought in a sterile courtroom. What I got was a war of attrition, a slow, grinding siege fought not with brilliant arguments, but with mountains of paper and endless, soul-crushing procedural maneuvers. The enemy's strategy was brutally simple. They weren't trying to outsmart us. They were trying to bankrupt us. They aimed to make the process of defending ourselves so monumentally expensive and exhausting that surrender would become our only logical option. This wasn't a battle for justice. It was a slow, methodical financial exsanguination. Our gleaming Olympus of glass became a fortress under siege, and the enemy wasn't at the gates. They were already inside, disguised as due process. The first phase of their assault was called discovery, a harmless-sounding term for a truly monstrous process. They requested everything, every email I had ever sent that contained the word signal, every lab notebook from my university days, every internal memo, every schematic, every line of source code, every transcript of every meeting. It was a digital tsunami. Our IT department had to pull terabytes of data. We hired a fleet of paralegals who worked around the clock in a windowless room, sifting through millions of documents for anything remotely relevant to the case. The cost was staggering, a hemorrhage of cash that flowed directly from our research and development budget into the coffers of our legal team and external consultants. I spent weeks locked in depositions, a form of psychological torture disguised as a fact-finding mission. Their lawyers, a team of men with grey faces and emotionless eyes, questioned me for hours on end about notes I had scribbled 15 years ago, about the precise meaning of a word in a decade-old email. Their goal wasn't to find a smoking gun. There was none. Their goal was to wear me down, to trap me in a contradiction, to make me so weary of the fight that I would beg for it to end. While this paper war was draining our treasury, they opened a second, more insidious front. This one wasn't fought in the courts, but in the dark corners of the internet. A digital whisper campaign began. It started subtly, an anonymous comment on a patient support forum. "Has anyone using the Synapse Bridge experienced recurring headaches?" A friend of a friend told me. Then a post on a fringe tech blog from a supposed former employee, raising vague concerns about our device's long-term safety protocols. It was all unsubstantiated, all impossible to trace back to a source, but it planted a seed of doubt. The internet, I learned, is a fertile ground for fear. These whispers were amplified by bots, creating the illusion of a groundswell of concern. Patients would call our support lines, their voices trembling, asking if the miracle device that allowed them to walk could be giving them cancer. It was venomous. It was a lie. A carefully constructed phantom designed to attack not our patent but our reputation. It was a direct assault on the hope we provided. The pressure began to create fissures within our own walls. The Olympus of glass started to feel less like a fortress and more like a pressure cooker. Our quarterly board meetings, once celebratory affairs, became tense and adversarial. The stock price, once a source of collective pride, was now a constant silent accuser, its daily fluctuations dictating the mood of the entire executive floor. The legal fees were a black hole on our balance sheet, and the negative chatter online was making investors nervous. Mark, the man who had championed this crusade, was now the one showing me charts of our declining market capitalization. "Silas, we're spending $1 million a week on this," he said during one tense meeting, his voice devoid of its usual optimistic swagger. "The street is getting spooked by this safety nonsense. Maybe we should reconsider a settlement, find a number." Hearing those words from him felt like a profound betrayal. "A number? Mark, you were the one who said we had to fight. You said we would make them an example," I shot back, my voice rising. "This is a moral fight, not a financial one." He ran his hand over his tired face. "Everything is a financial fight, Silas. I thought we could win quickly, make a big public splash. I didn't sign up for a decade-long war in the trenches. Our shareholders didn't sign up for it. We're a public company now. We have a fiduciary duty to protect their investment, not your principles." The word "your" hung in the air between us, a stark reminder that my creation was no longer truly mine. I was merely its steward, and my sense of right and wrong was now considered a liability. I refused. I told the board that settling would be an admission of guilt we did not have, a betrayal of every patient who relied on us. I still had enough voting power to hold the line, but I could feel my support eroding. I was becoming isolated, the fanatical captain of a ship whose crew was beginning to believe he was steering them directly into a hurricane. The turning point? The moment the hairline fractures in our foundation splintered into a catastrophic crack, didn't happen in a courtroom or a boardroom. It happened on a grey Tuesday afternoon. I received a phone call from Dr. Alistair Finch, the head of neurosurgery at a major Chicago hospital. His institution had been one of our earliest and most vocal champions. They had built an entire wing dedicated to rehabilitation using our technology. He was a friend, a man I deeply respected. His voice on the phone was strained formal. "Silas," he began, the warmth gone, "I'm calling to inform you that we are putting a temporary hold on the Neuralink program." I felt the blood drain from my face. "A hold? Alistair, why? Is there an issue with the hardware, a software bug?" There was a pause, and I could hear the discomfort in his silence. "No, the technology is performing as expected," he said finally. "But the board has raised concerns. The ongoing litigation and the persistent online reports regarding potential long-term patient safety issues. Until these matters are resolved and public confidence is restored, our risk management department feels it's prudent to pause all procedures." I hung up the phone, my hand trembling. The whispers had become a roar. The lies had become reality. The phantom had drawn blood. They hadn't needed to prove their case in court. They had successfully weaponized doubt, transforming an abstract legal threat into a tangible operational crisis. This wasn't about our patent anymore. This wasn't even about our stock price. They had found a way to attack the very heart of our mission, to sever the connection between our technology and the patients who needed it. It was the first time I truly understood the nature of the enemy I was facing. They weren't just trying to take my money, they were trying to erase my legacy. And I finally realized, with a cold, terrifying clarity, that they were winning. The news of the Chicago hospital pausing our program was not a leak, it was a detonation. Mark, ever the strategist, had tried to contain it, to frame it as a minor procedural hiccup. But our opponents were far more skilled at this game of shadows than we were. Within hours, a major financial news network ran a headline that felt like a punch to the gut. "Safety concerns and legal woes plague Neuralink, key hospital halts groundbreaking program." The article was a masterpiece of insinuation, weaving together the reality of the lawsuit with the fiction of the online smear campaign, creating a narrative of a company in turmoil. It didn't need to state that our technology was dangerous. It just needed to ask the question. In the world of high-stakes finance, the question is often as damaging as the answer. The market's reaction was immediate and brutal. When the opening bell rang the next morning, our stock didn't just dip, it plummeted. I watched on the large screen in the boardroom as the ticker symbol for Neuralink NLNC turned a blood red, a digital wound bleeding out in real time. It dropped 30% in the first hour, erasing billions of dollars in shareholder value before most people had finished their morning coffee. The Olympus of glass, once a symbol of serene confidence, became a hive of frantic, panicked activity. Phones rang incessantly. Crisis meetings were convened and then abandoned. The very air in the building seemed to crackle with fear. The narrative that Mark had so carefully constructed of Silas Blackwood, the visionary genius, was being rewritten overnight. Now I was Silas Blackwood, the stubborn, reckless CEO, the man whose monumental ego was dragging his revolutionary company into the abyss. The media, which had once celebrated my idealism, now condemned my obstinance. This catastrophic drop in value triggered a cascade of secondary crises. We had lines of credit, corporate loans tied to the value of our stock. With our market capitalization eviscerated, we were suddenly in violation of our loan covenants. Our creditors, the large, impersonal banks that had eagerly funded our expansion, were now on the phone with Mark, their voices cold and demanding. They wanted a plan. They wanted reassurance. They wanted us to stop the bleeding. The pressure on me, from the board, from our investors, from Mark himself, became immense and unbearable. The fight was no longer an abstract moral crusade. It was a five-alarm fire threatening to burn the entire enterprise to the ground. It was in this crucible of fear and desperation that I was forced to make a series of choices that felt like self-mutilation. To free up capital to both appease our creditors and continue funding the insatiable appetite of our legal defense, we had to make cuts. Deep, painful cuts that went against every principle I held. The first to go was our charitable access program, a fund we had established to provide the Synapse Bridge to patients who couldn't afford it. It was, to me, the soul of the company. In one afternoon meeting, that soul was sacrificed on the altar of fiscal responsibility. Next came the layoffs. I had to sign termination letters for brilliant young engineers and researchers from our R&D division, the very people who were developing the next generation of our technology. I looked into their shocked and betrayed faces as they packed their belongings, and I saw a reflection of my own failure. I was dismantling my own dream, piece by piece, in a desperate attempt to save the hollowed-out corporate shell it had become. My personal life began to fray and unravel. The stress was a constant corrosive presence. I stopped sleeping. Food tasted like ash. The joy I once found in my home laboratory vanished. The familiar hum of the equipment now sounded like an accusation. My wife, Eleanor, tried to reach me, but I was unreachable, lost in a labyrinth of legal documents and financial projections. Our conversations became clipped and functional, stripped of all warmth. One evening she found me staring blankly at a wall in my study at 3 a.m. "Silas, this is killing you," she whispered, her voice filled with a pain I couldn't bear to acknowledge. "It's just a company, it's just money, let it go." But I couldn't. To me, it wasn't just a company, it was my life's work. It was Chloe's painting. It was the pianist's nocturne. Letting it go felt like letting all of them down. "You don't understand," I told her, and in that moment the distance between us felt like a vast, unbridgeable canyon. The final desperate gambit to save the company was a private equity deal. Mark found a firm willing to inject a massive amount of capital, enough to stabilize our finances and see the lawsuit through to the end. But their price was steep. It wasn't just a stake in the company, it was a pound of flesh. They demanded a complete restructuring of the board, and they demanded a new CEO. They wanted a wartime general, a corporate turnaround specialist, not a scientist founder they viewed as emotionally compromised. For the deal to go through, I had to agree to step down. I had to surrender control of the very thing I had brought into existence. The board meeting where this was presented was the most surreal experience of my life. I was being asked to sacrifice myself to save the company. Mark presented it not as a betrayal, but as a strategic necessity. "Silas, you're the founder. You're the heart of Neuralink," he said, the words feeling like a eulogy. "But right now, the market sees you as the problem. This is the only way to save what you've built. You'll still be on the board, you'll still have your lab. You'll be the chief innovation officer. This is about saving the mission." It was a beautifully packaged execution. They were taking my power, but leaving me a title, a gilded cage, where I could watch from the sidelines. I looked around the table at the faces of the people who had once hailed me as a visionary. Now their eyes were filled with a mixture of pity and impatience. I was an obstacle. My principles had become baggage they were eager to shed. Exhausted, defeated, and seeing no other path forward, I agreed. I signed the documents that effectively made me a guest in my own house. A week later, I was sitting in my new, smaller office, attending the first board meeting under the new regime. I was a spectator. The new CEO, a sharp, emotionless man named Decker, was at the head of the table. And then Mark made an announcement that stopped my heart. He informed the board that with Decker's approval, he had re-established contact with Cognitive Pathway Ventures. They were reopening settlement negotiations. I stared at him, my mind reeling. "What are you doing?" I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. "We're almost at the trial date. We can still win this." Mark wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked at Decker, who answered for him. "Mr. Blackwood," Decker said, his tone dismissive, "this company has been paralyzed by your personal crusade for far too long. We are a business, not a debating society. My mandate is to end this distraction and restore shareholder value. We are going to settle." Mark finally turned to me, his face a mask of calculated regret. "It's just a business move, Silas," he said softly. "You made this personal." In that instant, I saw the full, horrifying truth. I hadn't been fighting a legal battle. I had been fighting a culture, a world where truth was irrelevant and everything, even a miracle, had a price. And in that world, I had already lost. That boardroom felt like a tomb. My voice, once the most powerful in the room, was now just a powerless echo. I was a ghost at my own funeral, watching strangers decide the fate of my creation. They were about to sell the company's future to put an end to a conflict I had initiated out of principle. For those of you who have followed my story this far, perhaps you've felt that same sense of being betrayed by a system you once believed in. If you have, do me a favor and subscribe if you haven't already. And I want you to think about this and let me know in the comments. What do you think my greatest mistake was? Trusting too much in the beginning, or not knowing when to stop fighting in the end? The settlement negotiations were swift and brutal. I was not invited to participate. I was merely informed of the outcome in a sterile memo. The new CEO, Decker, saw the lawsuit not as an injustice to be fought, but as a cancerous tumor on the company's financials. His approach was not to win, but to excise it as quickly as possible, regardless of the cost. The price he agreed to was staggering. It wasn't just a one-time payment, it was a surrender. Neuralink agreed to pay Cognitive Pathway Ventures a 9-figure sum immediately. But that was only the beginning of the humiliation. The truly devastating part of the deal was the second clause, a perpetual licensing fee. We had to pay them a royalty, a percentage of the revenue from every single Synapse Bridge unit sold, forever. The troll, the parasitic entity that had never invented anything, never helped a single patient, never contributed a single shred of value to the world, would now receive a tax on every miracle we performed. They had won. They had attached themselves to our bloodstream and would feed on us for the rest of our existence. The day the agreement was signed, an email went out to the entire company. Decker called it a strategic resolution that would allow Neuralink to move forward and focus on its core mission. On Wall Street, the news was greeted with relief. The uncertainty was over. Our stock price actually ticked upwards, a reward for our capitulation. In the Olympus of glass, there was a palpable sense of a storm having passed. People were smiling again. They saw it as the end of a long, dark chapter. Only I understood that it wasn't the end of the chapter, it was the end of the book. The payment, while massive, was something the company could, in theory, absorb. But the agreement was an anchor, and we were sailing into a storm. The first domino fell within a month. The massive cash payout to the troll had drained our liquid reserves to dangerously low levels. This breach of our financial covenants with our lenders was now not a potential threat, but a hard reality. The banks that had been nervous before were now openly hostile. They called in their loans, all of them, all at once. It was a coordinated, bloodless execution. Decker and his new team scrambled, trying to secure emergency financing, but the stench of our capitulation was all over the company. New investors saw the perpetual royalty payments not as a settled issue, but as a permanent weakness, a structural flaw in our business model. No one was willing to invest in a company that was legally bound to tithe a significant portion of its earnings to a parasite. The downward spiral was terrifyingly fast. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. We didn't have the capital to meet our debt obligations. We didn't have the cash flow to fund our operations. The layoffs this time were not strategic. They were desperate. We shuttered entire departments, the marketing team, the sales force, even the administrative staff. The gleaming Olympus of glass became a ghost tower, floors of empty cubicles and silent conference rooms. The final unthinkable blow came when Decker announced that all research and development on the next generation of the Synapse Bridge was being suspended indefinitely. The future was cancelled. We were no longer a company of innovation. We were a company in survival mode, and we were losing. The end came in the form of a Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing. It was the only option left. The company, my life's work, was now in the hands of creditors and a bankruptcy court. The process was a public dissection. Every decision, every expense, every hope and dream we ever had was laid bare on legal documents for vultures to pick over. My name, once synonymous with genius, was now irrevocably linked to one of the most spectacular collapses in the history of biotech. The humiliation was absolute, and through it all, I had to sit on the board and watch, a powerless figurehead to the very end. The bankruptcy auction was the final degradation. The assets of Neuralink were sold off for pennies on the dollar. Our state-of-the-art manufacturing facilities, our distribution network, our patient data, all of it was carved up and sold to the highest bidder. The most valuable asset, of course, was our portfolio of patents. All of my work, all of my team's brilliant discoveries, every late night and every breakthrough. It was all bundled together and sold to a massive, soulless pharmaceutical conglomerate. I later learned they bought it primarily to bury it, as it competed with a more profitable line of palliative drugs they were selling. My technology, which had given people back their lives, was now locked away in a corporate vault, a threat to someone else's bottom line. My personal fortune, which had once been a staggering figure, was entirely tied up in Neuralink stock. When the company filed for bankruptcy, that stock became worthless. It was nothing more than a collection of meaningless digital certificates. The paper billions evaporated into thin air. The mansions, the cars, the investments I had made, I had leveraged much of it to help the company during the crisis, and the rest was seized by personal creditors to cover the debts. I watched as movers packed up my life, emptying the house that had once been a symbol of my success. They took the art from the walls, the furniture from the rooms. But the only thing I truly mourned was the lab. I stood at the doorway of my home laboratory, the place where I had done my best work, and watched as men in overalls carefully dismantled the custom-built equipment. They packed away the spectrographs and the electron microscopes, crating up the physical embodiment of my intellect and my passion. When they were done, all that was left was an empty room, silent and sterile. That silence was the sound of my life's work coming to a complete and final end. I was no longer a CEO, a billionaire, or an innovator. I was just a man in his late 50s, with nothing left but the clothes on his back and a name that was now a synonym for failure. For the first year after the collapse, I ceased to exist. That's the only way I can describe it. I didn't just lose a fortune, I lost my identity, my purpose, my narrative. I was Silas Blackwood, the man who created the Synapse Bridge. When that was gone, what was left? My days were a featureless grey fog. My wife Eleanor and I moved into a small two-bedroom apartment that our son rented for us, its thin walls a constant, humiliating reminder of how far we had fallen. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on me from the moment I woke up until the merciful oblivion of sleep. Friends and former colleagues stopped calling. I don't blame them. What do you say to a man who has lost everything? My name became a cautionary tale whispered in Silicon Valley boardrooms, a ghost story used to frighten ambitious founders. I was a pariah. For a time, I allowed the bitterness to consume me. I would spend hours replaying every mistake, every betrayal. My mind a courtroom where I was simultaneously the prosecutor, the defendant, and the helpless jury. I blamed Mark, Decker, the board, the banks, and most of all the faceless troll who had set the entire inferno ablaze. The change didn't come as a sudden epiphany. It was a slow, painful crawl back into the light, and it began with a simple, humbling act. Eleanor, who had watched my descent into despair with a quiet, unwavering strength, finally gave me an ultimatum. It wasn't angry, it was loving. "Silas," she said one morning, finding me unshaven and staring at the same spot on the wall I'd been staring at for weeks. "I have watched you grieve for a world you lost. Now you have a choice. You can either let that world kill the man I married, or you can find a reason to live in the one we have now." That day she dragged me out of the apartment and to a local community college. She had seen an advertisement. They needed volunteer tutors in the science department. The thought was mortifying. Me, a man who had once lectured at MIT and Stanford, tutoring freshmen in basic physics. But the look in her eyes told me this wasn't a suggestion. It was a lifeline. My first day there was one of the most difficult of my life. A young student, no older than 18, approached me with a question about electrical resistance. As I started to explain Ohm's law, something shifted inside me. I was no longer Silas Blackwood, the failed billionaire. I was just a teacher, sharing knowledge. I saw the spark of understanding in the student's eyes, that little flicker of connection when a complex idea becomes clear. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. It was clean. It was real. It had nothing to do with stock prices or legal strategy. It was the pure, unadulterated joy of science, the very thing that had set me on my path in the first place. That small moment was the first stone in a new foundation. I started to see the world differently. My focus had been so narrow for so long, on my invention, my company, my battle. The fall had shattered that lens, forcing me to see the broader landscape. I began reading about other inventors, other small companies, who were being suffocated by the same parasitic litigation that had destroyed me. The system wasn't just broken, it was an actively predatory ecosystem, and bright, innovative minds were its preferred prey. The anger I felt began to transform. The bitter, corrosive rage I had directed at my own failure started to morph into a focused, protective anger on behalf of others. My purpose wasn't to rebuild what I had lost. My purpose was to prevent others from suffering the same fate. I didn't have money or influence, but I had something more valuable, a PhD in failure. I had a story. I knew the Trolls' playbook by heart. I understood their tactics, their psychology, their strategy of weaponizing the legal system's own complexity against its users. I started a blog, writing under a pseudonym at first, detailing the anatomy of a patent troll attack. I explained the legal maneuvers, the PR games, the psychological warfare. I offered advice on how to prepare, how to defend, and most importantly, when to recognize that a fight for principle is actually a trap. The blog slowly gained a following. I started receiving emails, first 1 or 2, then a dozen a week. They were from young founders, garage inventors, academics, people just like I had been, terrified and confused, holding a demand letter from a legal phantom. That's how the Inventors Shield Foundation was born. It's not a company. It's not even a formal non-profit yet. It's just me in the spare bedroom of our apartment with a second-hand laptop and a cheap headset. I've become a pro bono consultant, a strategist for the underdogs. I spend my days on video calls talking founders off the ledge. I help them connect with ethical lawyers who work on contingency. I review their patents and help them draft responses. I teach them how to distinguish between a legitimate legal challenge and predatory extortion. I am forging a new legacy, not from patents and profits, but from scars and wisdom. My name is not on the cover of magazines anymore, but it's whispered with gratitude in the late-night Zoom calls of struggling startups. I lost every dollar I ever made, but in the silence that followed the crash, I found something I hadn't realized I'd lost. Myself. The money and the fame had amplified my intellect, but they had also amplified my pride and my blindness. I built a glass tower and convinced myself it was a fortress when it was always just a cage. The fall shattered the glass and forced me to walk on the ground again. My wealth now is not measured in dollars, but in the small victories of others. A young engineer who successfully invalidates a frivolous patent. A medical startup that settles for a tiny fraction of the original demand because of a strategy I helped them devise. A brilliant mind that doesn't have to give up on their dream. I learned the hardest lesson of all. True innovation isn't just about the brilliant act of creation. It's about the gritty, thankless work of protecting that creation's right to exist in a hostile world. I lost the battle for my own invention, but in doing so, I found a way to help win the war for countless others. And that is a form of wealth that no lawsuit, no bankruptcy, and no troll can ever take away from me. If my story has meant anything to you, I ask you to share it with a dreamer, a creator, or anyone in your life who is fighting their own impossible battle. And finally, please tell me in the comments, what is the most valuable lesson that failure has ever taught you? I will read every single one of your responses. Thank you for listening.